This is my always growing colony of guppies and their no-filter ecosystem aquarium. For 2 years they've thrived here, but this setup has problems that keep me from fully enjoying it. That's why I'm about to replace it with this massive shallow aquarium, which I'll design around a similar low-tech no-filter framework, but within a pond-style environment. This video is sponsored by Fritz Aquatics. These guppies originally lived in a planter pot pond 4 years ago. It was a low-tech system that utilized tropical plants to clean the water. 2 years later, I used similar techniques when I upgraded them to this 60-gallon aquarium. Like its planter pot predecessor, its success has come from capitalizing on natural processes to sustain an ecosystem. However, instead of plants growing in terracotta pots, branches and stones hold bare root plants just above the water. As you can see, they've grown quite well, and their roots provide refuge for the fish. The combination of these plants and beneficial bacteria colonies living on the surfaces clean the water so effectively that a filter isn't required. In 2 years, I've performed fewer than a dozen water changes. Other than feeding the fish, occasionally trimming plants, and topping off the water, it's largely self-sufficient. Based on all of that, you're probably wondering, what problems does this tank have that stop you from fully enjoying it? The first issue is twofold: the tank's height and its location on a rack. Hindsight is 20/20, and while cube tanks look cool, it wasn't the ideal footprint here. The irony of the tank being relatively maintenance-free is that when I need to do something, it's not easy. For example, reaching the bottom to remove mulm while standing on a ladder and attempting to work around inquisitive fish is a bit of a challenge. No one has ever been harmed in the process, but over the years a few fish have insisted on taking a joyride, which is why I now put a net on the end. Additionally, these excitable fish and pretty much everything between leave water spots on the glass that are more difficult to clean than they need to be because of the first issue. I left it that way so you can see for yourself. The height also causes aesthetic and functional challenges with lighting. Out of necessity, it's 3 feet tall, and while extremely bright, most of it is blocked by the leaves. This greatly reduces visibility and hinders aquatic plant growth. Surprisingly, the swords are still going, but they could look much better. I'm sure they'll bounce back after moving to the new tank. Finally were bad design choices, one of which was situating the hardscape too close to the glass. I think it looks good, but it's really annoying to work around. While I like the contrast it creates with the sand, I gave up on keeping a clean aesthetic long ago. Remember, cleaning the mulm is a challenge to begin with, and the light sand only makes that harder. Unrelated, but I didn't even add enough, and the substrate bags have begun to poke through. Luckily, all these issues are easily remedied, just not with this tank. Most of the issues stem from its dimensions, so I plan to address those by making a shallow tank on a short stand. Theoretically, that would solve the accessibility and lighting challenges. Better lighting means more aquatic plants, which I'd like to be a focus within an improved design that leaves more room around the hardscape and uses darker substrate. Finally, all of that must maintain the same low-tech framework as before, just in a larger tank. All of that really only scratches the surface of what I've planned, but it puts to paper what my intentions are at least. Before I could do anything with the tank, I had to build a stand. I'll provide some context for that as it ultimately inspired most of the project. Around this time last year, I began the journey of restructuring the animal room. Simply put, my goal was and is to streamline everything to be as easily maintained as possible. Part of that is replacing setups like this. As I began to do that, I realized my long-term goals had evolved. Rather than fitting as many enclosures as possible, I'd prefer to focus on fewer specialty designs and larger items. That included this guppy tank, which gave me the perfect opportunity to make something unlike anything I've done before. An aquarium with a 360-degree view. This will be the first thing you see as you enter the room, and maybe it's just me, but I can't think of much that would give a better first impression than being greeted by a herd of guppies. Due to the nature of this project, I'm making everything differently than I usually do. I began by processing dimensional lumber, including 4x4 posts. I sent them through the planer to clean up the surfaces. Then I marked 4 and secured a guide to quickly make a consistent bottom cut for notches. I used a pull saw to do the rest. These notches will bear the weight of a tank by holding a 2x6 frame shelf measuring 4 feet by 3 feet. I didn't want any possibility of sagging, so I figured it would be best to use large boards like these. I also didn't want visible fasteners, patches, or plugs, so I used pocket holes to assemble the frame. The legs fit perfectly into it. The bottom also needed support, but it didn't require as much, so I used 2x4s instead. I also added corner support with a lag screw. After dropping the frame into the notches and securing it from the inside corners, the stand was nearly complete. It just needed bracing and shelves. I cut those out of plywood, veneered the edges, and sanded them smooth. As a floating tank, I figured mobility would be important. Now I doubt I'll actually move it much, if ever. I just like having the option. That's where these leveling casters came in. They'll make it mobile, while also streamlining the leveling process. I wouldn't actually need them until later, but they helped me get the stand outside for sanding. It was exciting to finally see some progress, especially when I went to stain the boards, because this project had just been an idea for nearly a year. I had the glass custom cut at a local shop, and I was in luck because my order was ready for pickup the following day. However, an unexpected issue arose.
Never a dull moment here at SerpaDesign, and that's because with these big ambitious projects, they tend to come with a slew of issues, but I'm not complaining. It helps build patience. As you can see, I've got the pieces test fit here just to make sure I didn't make any more mistakes, and thankfully I didn't. It came together really well and it looks awesome. The thing was, whenever I went to the glass shop a little bit ago to pick things up, as soon as they set this bottom piece onto the table for me to check the measurements, I took one look at it and I knew immediately I just made a huge error. Let me show you what's going on. From the front you can't really notice anything, but as soon as I come to the side here, it's glaringly obvious what I did. For whatever reason, I didn't make this stand wide enough. Not sure how I did that. I guess I wasn't checking my measurements close enough, but needless to say, I gotta redo a lot of this now.
Either I had too much on my mind, or got confused because I was batch processing wood for multiple stands. One of those used the same boards as the top frame, but I had to take them for this project instead. It's kind of funny because intuitively I did think the stand looked off as I was working on it, and for whatever reason I didn't bother to check the measurements sooner. Thankfully I only had to adjust the depth, and nothing from before was wasted. After making amends, I sanded and stained the new sections. However, this wasn't going to fit through any of my doors, which meant I had no choice but to dismantle it again. I knew the old version would fit because I saw it next to the door, and I guess that should have been my giveaway that the stand was too small from go. Regardless, I still had to seal it, and water-based pulleys are the best option when doing it directly in the animal room. The last thing I had to fix were the shelves. I cut the ones I had already made in half and measured the distance between them. Then I used the sheet remnant to fill those by combining the panels along the edges. Also, here's a better look at how those casters work. You set the direction and simply crank the lever to extend or retract the leveling foot.
2 days after the fact and I finally got this thing built. Turned out pretty well and it's ready for the tank. The thing is though that I'm going to build the tank directly on top of here, which is not what I'd typically do, but I think the way that I'm actually going to construct it will make it easier, and so that way once it's here it doesn't have to be moved again.
First things first, no rimless tank would be complete without a leveling mat. While the tank was together, I figured I might as well tape the seams. This was actually easier because I could do it all by eye without taking measurements. And in case you're wondering, the bottom is 3/8 inch thick and the sides are 1/2 inch thick. While thinner, the bottom is by far the heaviest piece. After moving it to the stand, I cleaned the edges with isopropyl alcohol to remove oil and debris that could compromise the silicone seal. Now I had to get creative with these heavy pieces of glass because I was working alone. First I clamped boards to the stand to hold the sides. They were tilted and likely would have stayed, but I taped them just in case. These gave me the extra hands I needed, and adding the other sides was quite easy. However, there was another oversight.
I do not want this to keep being the theme of projects, and trust me when I say that I have better things than faking drama for content, but it happened again. If you see, the tank is pretty tall, and that was not my intent. I wanted it to be like a frag style tank where I could look down over it and it'd be easy to maintain, but as you can see, that didn't happen. And the reason is that I didn't subtract the tank height from the stand, and so when you're looking at this, the top of the stand actually should be where the top of the tank is. So I have to modify this in the animal room because I can't get the stand out of the room because it's too big, right? So I gotta try to find a workaround here.
In other words, the stand should have been 14 inches shorter than it is. I was going to cut off that much, which is why I removed the shelf. However, I determined removing just the bottom 8 inches would be sufficient. I cut them by hand to minimize airborne sawdust. Although annoying, I'm actually glad it happened this way because the adjusted height ended up being more appropriate than if it were shorter. Usually I apply silicone to the glass before assembling the tank. That works well, but I wanted to try something different here because of the size of this aquarium. You'll see here that the bumpers I placed between the glass create a separation. This prevents the glass from squeezing out the silicone that holds the tank together. However, in this instance, they'd also allow me to inject the silicone between the glass to create the seam. I've seen it done before, so I knew it could work. It was just a matter of trying it for myself. It went pretty well, and to be honest, is probably easier than how I would usually do it. Everything after that is the same as usual. Apply the internal seam, smooth it out, and remove the tape. While that cured, I made the light. Well, I didn't make the light itself. I'm using 2 of these LED spotlights. I mean a housing for them to match the stand. First, I sent boards through the planer to reduce weight. Then I chopped them down and created pocket holes. I glued and screwed them together before adding a mounting board for the lights, anchoring boards for the ceiling mount, and finishing it. I had to determine how the lights should be staggered to maximize the spread. I used my measurements to mount the lights within the hood. I also added a splitter so there's only one cord. I used these milk crates and a laser level to get everything properly aligned. You can't see it behind the drop ceiling here, but I attached eye hooks directly to the ceiling joists for the light chains. Here's a better look at how it all came together.
Now this I could work with. I love the fact that it has a 360-degree view, which will also allow me to access all parts of the tank very easily, and I just think it looks cool. But the part I've really been excited about is to get this thing scaped, and that's what we're gonna do next.
This is a large tank, and for it to look right, I knew I needed some stones to match. Unfortunately, nothing in the studio was going to cut it. That's when I went outside to take some from a different feature that I'm working on. However, most of these were a little too big. I had to sift through and find what I needed. In no time, I had a suitable selection of sandstone to work with. I just had to rinse them off first. I like working with sandstone because of its porosity. This characteristic allows it to wick water, making it perfect for growing moss and other plants beyond the water's surface. That's one of the reasons I use them for my ponds and riparian setups. In fact, these are what I used in this low-tech fish tank. I'll do similar things in this tank, so they were a perfect option for it. The thing is, I couldn't just go and drop a few 100 pounds of stones directly in the tank. That's why I trimmed down some egg crate to fit in the bottom. This will evenly spread out the weight of the stones, eliminating pressure points that could crack the glass. The trick with using large stones is that they have to remain stable. Sometimes a little wedge rock is more than enough to get that done. Sandstone's texture is nice because it's dynamic, but you usually don't have to be conscious about it. In contrast, something like dragonstone looks off with an inconsistent texture. Sandstone tends to appear natural regardless. My goal with this initial formation was to create a platform for riparian plant growth. I didn't want to leave any room for guessing, so I enlisted the help of the laser level to account for the water line. What I was going for at first could work, I just had to stack it on top of another rock to get more height. That was easy enough. It became more challenging when I started working in Mupani wood. While I found configurations that looked good from the front or side, I had to maintain an appealing and cohesive look from all 5 sides: the left, right, front, back, and top. Easier said than done in a glass box, especially when I'm used to scaping from one dimension, the front. That said, I also didn't want to make something too contrived. Of course, I wanted an appealing hardscape, but I actually want the primary focus to be on the plants long term. Slowly but surely things came together, and I think the scape looks fairly dynamic, especially considering that it was my first time creating something in an aquarium meant to be viewed from every side. Just keep in mind that I'm seeing this in my head with all of the plants, so much of it won't be visible in the end. There's nothing worse than putting in all of this work only to have floating driftwood or bumping something out of place during maintenance. I mixed up aquarium safe epoxy and pressed it between the contact points. However, as I did this, I realized the scape could be centered better. That's when I trimmed off all the unneeded egg crate and carefully slid the hardscape. It might not look like I did much from here, but I think it made a huge difference. I knew the substrate would as well. I just had to prepare it first. I began by sending topsoil through a sieve to remove large particles. I'd combined this with clay gravel and cycled substrate from a different tank to help jumpstart the system. It's a blend of aqua soil, sand, and gravel. At this point, I think all of my planted tanks use substrate bags. They do a great job of keeping fine particles below the cosmetic layer of sand where they're supposed to be. That is, if they don't start peeking through like they are in the Guppy's current home. The Fritz Super Sax Media bags are my go-to for making them. I simply fill them to achieve a thickness of roughly 3/4 of an inch, flatten them out, tie the cord, and snip off the excess. The thing is, this tank occupies 12 square feet, so I had to make quite a few to fill the areas where I wanted plants. Generally, I keep them close to the hardscape and away from the glass so they can be completely hidden. Rest assured, I rinsed the sand very well. Otherwise, I would have had cloudy water, and I did not want to deal with that. I also wasn't about to have that light sand malm issue again, instead mixing together 3 different dark colors. It's not that I have an issue with malm itself, but it tends to be an eyesore with light sand. So far, everything had gone a long way toward transforming this location and the tank. However, something about the substrate brought it all full circle. It was getting real. To reiterate, this had been an idea for nearly a year, and seeing this had me very excited. I knew the plants were about to make it look even better, but first, it had to be filled with water. I gotta be honest, I usually don't get concerned about this. I've made a lot of tanks and stands, and I've rarely had issues. This one was a little different though. As a precaution, you'll see that I kept checking various things while it filled because I didn't want anything else to go wrong this late in the process. Ultimately, everything was fine, and I was able to proceed. Here you can see the air in the stone being replaced with water. I think that's pretty cool. I brushed off all the bubbles and got to work with the plants. First up were the swords from the Guppy tank. They didn't seem to mind me taking them, and if anything were just curious. I removed the struggling leaves before putting them in their new home. In the process, I discovered what would become the first inhabitants, 2 ram's horn snails. This initial pop of green looked incredible, and not that I needed any, but it was great motivation to keep going. Next, I planted clusters of crypts in select locations. These might be my favorite aquatic plants because of their simple beauty and versatility. They just look good. Now keep in mind this is meant to be a pond style setup viewed from the top. I personally think it would have been a disservice not to add lilies to a shallow tank like this. I planted several bulbs of each species, but I bunched them together in 2 locations. I'd be remiss if I didn't share how crazy they're going in the lily tank right now. Imagine something like that in this new tank. Anyway, I continued adding larger plants near the swords and in the surrounding areas. As usual, I thought it was important to get as many leaf textures as possible. Doing so helps achieve a dynamic look. However, my plant stash was dwindling fast. I began to realize that I may have underestimated the number of plants I'd need. I accepted that this wasn't going to be as full as I'd like and would have to play the long game. Even so, I wasn't totally out of luck. This tank needed a good trim, which left me with a nice pile of Rotala. They helped significantly. I was also able to gather a few plants from other tanks, including banana plants that I put near the Rotala, Anubias and Bulbitis that I wedged in rocks, and Susfostertong that I nested around the hardscape. Both of the previous setups included riparian plant growth. To keep with the spirit of things, I had to do it again, starting with this Syngonium. I removed most of the substrate by hand and rinsed the remnants. These and the other plants I'd add after them looked incredible in a spot designed specifically for them and will go a long way in filtering the water. The process is really easy too. I'm just setting the plants on the hardscape in a way that their roots are submerged. Eventually they root in and stabilize, like this Hemigraphis, which needed a trim. I placed the cuttings directly into the new tank, where they'll eventually root in as well. If you want to learn more about this process, check out the definitive guide to growing houseplants in an aquarium, where I go over all the details. These riparian areas wouldn't be complete without moss, especially with sandstone. I also added a few more details, including bird's nest wood and small stones. While I was gathering plants from other aquariums, I managed to get something else: Malaysian trumpet snails. These are a great addition to low-tech setups because they dig and sift through the substrate, helping to keep it clean. What they can't clean is the outside of the tank. That's where Fritz Glass Cleaner comes in. This stuff is awesome because it repels dust, fingerprints, and water. However, what's more important is that it's animal safe, even for the inside of the rim. I also made sure to dose the tank with turbo start nitrifying bacteria to jumpstart the cycle and ensure it's safe for fish immediately. Even though everything is still in that fresh, newly established phase, I'm extremely pleased with it so far. Now that it was finally together, I was curious to see what the guppies would think.
The only thing left to do now is to transfer the guppies into their new tank. I don't know how many I'll be able to get straight up like this, but I might as well see what I can do.
I actually got more than I anticipated, and it was incredible to see them in their new home. What's surprising to me is that this tank isn't even twice the volume of the previous one. Where it differs most is its footprint. It's 3 times as much, 12 square feet as opposed to 4. It's one thing to know the difference, but another to see it. My next question was, how many times could I net the fish before they'd catch on? As the saying goes, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. What about 6 times though? By the 7th time they had caught on, and I had no choice but to dismantle their old tank. This gave me a better idea of just how extensive those root systems were. They were literally growing inside of the lava rock. Removing materials wasn't enough. I also had to siphon some water, and there'd be no joyrides this time because I put a sponge filter on the end. Down to a few inches of water, and I could catch the rest more easily. Don't get me wrong though, it was still a process because I had to keep netting up debris after releasing them into the new tank. You know it's a good day when you find a ton of snails as a bonus. However, the final addition was actually above the rim in the form of air plants. Other than a mono shrimp, I'm not sure what else should live in here, if anything. Let me know your thoughts. For now, guppies and snails will call it home, and with everyone safe and sound, I think it's time for a snack. Vitalis food. It's produced with a cold extrusion process that locks in nutrients while delivering soft, easily digestible food. That also makes it possible to do things like mashing it together for larger fish and communal feeding, or breaking it down into dust for nano fish, which is what I do for the guppies. I tried luring them in by tapping the water and sprinkling in a little food, but only a few arrived. That was until I stepped away and everyone began emerging from the woodwork, literally. I don't know about you, but I absolutely love seeing all the disturbances at the water's surface as they nibble. That was a week ago, which isn't long, but a lot has happened since. You'll probably notice immediately that the water is tinted with tannins. Driftwoods and especially Mupani are notorious for darkening water. Thankfully, the branches I used came from dismantled setups where they had largely done that, so the effect was minimal. If that wasn't the case, the water would probably look like coffee right now. Anyone familiar with the channel knows that I enjoy black water tanks, but that's not the look I was going for here, nor would it be ideal for the guppies. Speaking of them, I fully regained their trust. Now I'm being greeted by that herd of guppies I imagined from the beginning. They also follow me around the tank wherever I'm at in the room, which I find endearing. Tony likes them too. Even so, I can't wait till there's more because it kinda looks empty right now. I'm sure that's gonna happen sooner than later with 100 to 200 fish already being in here, and with all the new hiding places for fish fry to safely develop. As the plants fill in, the fish should become more visible as well due to improved contrast. That's going to take time, but even in a week, there's already noticeable growth. For example, both the dwarf aquarium lilies and the banana plants have released a lot of foliage. It won't be long at all before they breach the water's surface. That said, they're both in a race that they've already lost to the tiger lotus. The 3 of these plants will cover much of the water's surface, which is why I didn't include floating plants like I usually would. However, these aren't the only plants that can and have breached the water's surface, as you can see with the water wisteria. What's interesting is that the now exposed foliage, if left alone, will continue to appear as it does. In contrast, the submerged leaves will deviate, taking on a completely different fork-like appearance. Nearly all the other stem plants will do the same if given the opportunity, though the varying growth patterns are not as dramatic. I'm also surprised by the crypts, which are generally slow growing. As expected, there are a few withered leaves, but for each of those, there are already fully established ones which weren't there before. They're not alone either, because nearly every other plant has either put on some height, filled in, or colored up. I can't forget about the riparian plants either. They've all adapted well to their new growing conditions. All this makes me extremely hopeful for the future of this tank, and I'm excited to see how it develops. I don't intend to perform any water changes on it, but that's only after it's become fully established, and for this one specifically, once the tannins are minimal. That's why I did this 50% water change. It's also really wise to check the water parameters on these new tanks, because if something's going to go wrong, it's usually early on. I got a reading on this with the Fritz test strips, and everything looked good. However, there was one more thing I still had to do. Add the Amano shrimp. I'll definitely need more, but 2 is a good start. This might be one of my favorite projects I've ever made. I know it will only get better with age too, but even now, there's just something about it. Perhaps it's because I've envisioned it for a while, or simply that I like guppies. Either way, it's incredible to be able to view the fish from so many angles. When I think of the perfect aquarium, it's this. Not that I actually think this aquarium is perfect, but that it perfectly showcases what an aquarium should be. An underwater paradise where aquatic life can live carefree while being enjoyed in wonder. You know what I mean? And I gotta be real, the 360-degree view is making me rethink everything about nature design. Not to mention the above the rim factor and its union with the world below the water. I think it all comes together to create something truly special. I'm excited to share this one's development in a few months and more of what I have planned for the animal room. A lot of work went into this, and I'm curious to know what you think. If you enjoyed this one, I know you'll like the time I made a giant jungle aquarium and the drop-off aquarium. As always, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, Serpa Squad, take care and peace.